Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the goldfields of northern Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the spring of 1962, a graduate student named Miriam Foss was conducting archival research at a private estate auction in Gainesville, Georgia, when she noticed something that would later cost her academic career and, some say, her peace of mind. Among the lot items scheduled for disposal was a portrait, oil on canvas, approximately 24 inches by 36 inches, depicting a woman whose beauty seemed almost defiant against the degradation of time and neglect. The canvas had been stored in a basement for decades, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked behind a false wall that had only been discovered during renovations. What drew Foss's attention was not merely the technical skill of the painting, which was considerable, but the eyes of the subject. They possessed a quality she would later describe in her notes as aware of being watched across time. The woman in the portrait wore a simple dress of indigo fabric, her hair wrapped in cloth of the same color, her posture upright despite the humble setting suggested by the plain background. In the lower right corner, barely visible beneath layers of grime, was a date, 1829, and beneath that, in letters so small they required magnification to read, Zenobia, property of C. Vance, Dahlonega District. The painting was purchased by Foss for $17, charged to her university research account. She transported it carefully back to her apartment in Athens, where she began the process of cleaning and documentation that scholars undertake with historical artifacts. It was during this process that she noticed something unusual. The canvas, when held at certain angles under direct light, showed irregularities in the paint layers. There appeared to be something beneath the surface image. Over the following weeks, Foss would employ increasingly sophisticated methods to examine the portrait, eventually consulting with a colleague in the chemistry department who had access to early X-ray fluorescence equipment. What they discovered would lead Foss to abandon her doctoral thesis on antebellum domestic architecture and pursue instead an investigation that would consume the remainder of her brief academic career. Beneath the portrait of Zenobia, there existed another painting entirely. The original image had been deliberately obscured, painted over with careful precision, as if someone had wanted to preserve what lay beneath, while simultaneously hiding it from view. The discovery was documented in Foss's research journal, entries dated between March and November of 1962, now archived at the Georgia Historical Society under restricted access. According to these notes, the underlying image showed the same woman, Zenobia, but in a different context entirely. She stood in what appeared to be an interior space, richly appointed, wearing clothing that suggested wealth and status far beyond what would have been permitted for an enslaved person in 1829 Georgia. The X-ray images were grainy, difficult to interpret with certainty, but they suggested the presence of other figures in the original composition. Foss noted that the overpainted surface, the visible portrait of Zenobia in simple dress, had been executed by the same hand as the hidden image beneath. The artists, whoever they were, had painted Zenobia twice, once in grandeur, then again in deliberate concealment. The question that would drive Foss's investigation was simple. Why? To understand what Foss uncovered, it becomes necessary to reconstruct the world into which both Zenobia and the portrait emerged. The year 1829 marked a transformation in northern Georgia unlike anything the region had previously experienced. In the summer of that year, a man named Benjamin Parks, according to widely circulated accounts, discovered gold while deer hunting in the hills near what would become Dahlonega. Within months, thousands of fortune seekers flooded into the Cherokee territory, establishing camps and crude mining operations across the landscape. The Georgia gold rush had begun, predating the more famous California rush by nearly 2 decades. This was not the organized, regulated enterprise that later gold rushes would become. It was chaos, violence, and greed operating under a thin veneer of frontier justice. The land itself was contested. The Cherokee Nation held treaty rights to much of the territory, rights that would be systematically violated and ultimately nullified by the Georgia state government and federal policy. Into this volatile environment came men of various backgrounds, some seeking fortune, others seeking to escape past failures or crimes. Among them was Cornelius Vance. Vance's name appears in county records beginning in late 1828, approximately 6 months before the gold discovery became public knowledge. This timing would later prove significant. He purchased a tract of land in what was then the Dahlonega district, an area that would soon be reorganized as Lumpkin County. The deed, recorded in November 1828, describes the property as containing approximately 300 acres of forested hillside along a tributary of the Chestatee River. The purchase price was modest, suggesting the land was not considered particularly valuable at the time. Vance paid in gold coin, a detail noted in the transaction record. Where a frontier settler acquired gold coin in significant quantity before the gold rush officially began, became one of the many questions that Foss would pursue. According to tax records from 1829 through 1835, Vance claimed ownership of 7 enslaved people. Their names appear in the county ledgers without surnames, as was the practice: Zenobia, Silas, Rufus, Calpurnia, Jorah, Minerva, and a man listed only as Old Caesar. Of these 7 individuals, only 2 would appear in subsequent records beyond 1835. The others vanished from documentation entirely, neither sold, inherited, manumitted, nor recorded as deceased in any official capacity. Foss's investigation into Cornelius Vance revealed a man who existed primarily in the margins of historical record. He was not prominent enough to appear in newspapers or civic documents with any frequency, yet he was clearly a man of some means. An inventory filed after his death in 1847 listed assets that included the original land tract. Now subdivided and partially sold, a 2-story timber frame house described as being in poor condition, mining equipment of various types, and personal effects valued at approximately $800. Notably absent from this inventory was any mention of enslaved people or human property. By 1847, Vance appeared to have divested himself of all such holdings, or they had disappeared from accounting for reasons the probate documents did not clarify. The inventory was conducted by a local attorney named Ambrose Crenshaw, whose own papers, donated to the Georgia Archives in 1923, would provide Foss with some of her most disturbing evidence. Among Crenshaw's papers was a letter dated February 1835, written in a cramped, defensive hand. The letter was addressed to no one, or rather, it appeared to be a draft of correspondence that may never have been sent. In it, Crenshaw described being summoned to Vance's property to witness the signing of certain documents. He did not specify the nature of these documents, but his discomfort was evident in every line. "I have been asked to set my name to papers of a nature I find troubling," he wrote. "Mr. Vance assures me all is in accordance with law, yet the law itself seems a poor compass in these matters. I have seen what I have seen, and I know what I am asked to ignore. The woman watches. She is always watching. I believe she knows more than she reveals, and what she reveals is already too much." The letter broke off without signature or conclusion. There was no indication of what action, if any, Crenshaw took following this draft. He remained Vance's attorney until the latter's death 12 years later. The woman who watches. Foss believed this referred to Zenobia, though the letter provided no explicit confirmation. Who was Zenobia? Where did she come from? How did she come to be on Vance's property in the remote hills of Georgia during one of the most chaotic periods in the state's history? These questions led Foss to examine slave manifests, bills of sale, and plantation records across Georgia and neighboring states. She found nothing. No woman by that name appeared in any documented sale or transfer that could be traced to Cornelius Vance in the relevant time period. It was as if Zenobia had simply materialized on the property without prior existence in the official record. This absence of documentation was not uncommon for enslaved people, whose lives were often poorly recorded, but given the other peculiarities of the case, Foss found the gap significant. She turned instead to indirect sources. Church records from the Dahlonega area included baptismal entries for several enslaved people during the 1829 to 1835 period, part of missionary efforts among the frontier population. Among these was an entry dated April 1830 for a woman identified as Zenobia, servant to C. Vance. The entry was unusual in that it included a note in the margin, added in different ink and possibly at a later date. Query her true name and origin. This marginal note was unsigned, but Foss traced the handwriting to Reverend Gideon Pratt, a Methodist circuit rider who served the region during that period. Pratt's own journal, preserved in fragmentary form at Emory University, contained several references to his visits to Vance's property, all of them brief and increasingly reluctant in tone. An entry from June 1831 stated simply, "Called upon the Vance homestead, was received with cold courtesy. Did not see the woman Zenobia, though I inquired after her soul's welfare. Was told she was indisposed. I suspect this is not illness of the body. I will not return to that house unbidden." There were no subsequent entries mentioning Vance or his household. Foss began to construct a timeline based on the available evidence. Sometime before November 1828, Cornelius Vance acquired property in the Dahlonega district. By April 1830, he possessed 7 enslaved people, including Zenobia. Between 1830 and 1835, something occurred that caused at least one witness, Attorney Crenshaw, to express grave discomfort. By 1847, all enslaved people had disappeared from Vance's holdings, and at some point during this period, someone had painted Zenobia's portrait twice, first in splendor, then in deliberate concealment. The portrait itself became Foss's primary focus. She arranged for more detailed analysis, including pigment testing and canvas dating, work conducted at the Smithsonian Institution's Conservation Laboratory in the summer of 1962. The results were illuminating. The canvas dated to the late 1820s, consistent with the visible date of 1829. The pigments used were characteristic of the period, including Prussian blue, lead white, and several earth tones. But the analysis revealed something unexpected. Mixed into the paint of the underlying portrait, the hidden image, were trace amounts of gold, not gold leaf applied to the surface, but gold dust mixed directly into the paint medium itself. This was an unusual technique, one that would have required access to raw gold in powdered form. In 1829, Georgia, there was only one likely source for such material: gold mining operations. The artist remained unidentified. The portrait bore no signature on either layer. The style suggested someone with formal training, not the work of an itinerant folk artist. The brushwork was confident, the proportions accurate, the rendering of fabric and flesh skillful. Foss contacted art historians specializing in antebellum Southern portraiture, but none could definitively attribute the work. What they did confirm was that the portrait's quality was inconsistent with the known economic status of Cornelius Vance. A man of his modest means would not typically commission such a work, particularly not a portrait of an enslaved person. Portraits of enslaved people did exist in antebellum art, but they were rare, usually commissioned by wealthy planters as part of larger family compositions or estate inventories, and almost never as standalone pieces that elevated the subject to the central focus with such dignity and presence. The X-ray images of the hidden portrait showed additional details that DeFosse found deeply unsettling. In the original composition, Zenobia stood in an interior that suggested refinement. Behind her, partially visible, were the shadowy forms of other figures. The imaging technology of 1962 could not render these figures with clarity, but their presence was undeniable. Fosse counted at least 3 other people in the composition, their exact positions and postures impossible to determine. One appeared to be seated, another standing to Zenobia's left, a third barely visible at the edge of the frame. Were these other enslaved people? Members of Vance's household? The ambiguity was maddening. What was clear, however, was that the original portrait depicted Zenobia not as isolated subject, but as part of a group, and that the artist had made a deliberate choice to paint over all of it, to reduce the complex scene to a single figure against a neutral background, stripped of context and relationship. In September 1962, Fosse traveled to Dahlonega to examine the landscape and search for any surviving structures connected to Cornelius Vance. The town had changed considerably since the 1830s, having served as a county seat and minor gold mining center before the California Rush drew away most of the ambitious miners. By the 1960s, it was a quiet mountain community trading on its gold rush heritage as a tourist attraction. The original Vance property was difficult to locate with precision. County boundary changes and subdivisions had obscured the original land grants. But through careful comparison of early survey maps with modern topography, Fosse identified a likely location approximately 4 miles northeast of the town square, in an area that had reverted largely to forest. She hired a local guide, a man named Vernon Webb, whose family had lived in the county since the 1840s, to help her navigate the terrain. Webb knew the area well, though he was skeptical of Fosse's interest in what he considered ancient history of no particular consequence. They found the site on a cool morning when fog still clung to the hollows between hills. The house itself was long gone. No trace of foundation or chimney stones remained visible. But Webb led Fosse to a slight depression in the earth, roughly rectangular, where he said old-timers claimed a structure had once stood. Near this depression was a well, or what remained of one, a circular stone-lined shaft now capped with rotted timbers and overgrown with briars. Webb advised against approaching too closely, as the cap seemed unstable. Fosse noted the location carefully. Surrounding the site were several trees of considerable age, including a massive white oak that would have been mature even in Vance's time. Carved into this oak, faint but still legible, were initials and dates from various periods. The earliest date Fosse could discern was 1834. The initials were worn beyond certain reading. While examining the tree, she noticed something else. An iron ring, approximately 6 inches in diameter, embedded in the trunk about 7 feet from the ground. The tree had grown around it, bark folding over the metal, but the ring's purpose was unmistakable. It was an attachment point, the kind used to secure animals, or in some contexts, people. Webb grew quiet when Fosse pointed this out. He mentioned reluctantly that there were stories about the property. Old stories that nobody really believed anymore. Stories about sounds in the night, about the well being unlucky, about surveying crews in the early 1900s refusing to work in that particular area after dark. He dismissed these as the usual folklore that accumulates around abandoned places, especially those with connections to the slavery era. Fosse asked if anyone had ever excavated the site, searched for artifacts or foundations. Webb said no, not to his knowledge. The land had passed through several hands over the decades, mostly used for timber or left fallow. Nobody had shown much interest in the history of the place until now. Fosse spent the remainder of that day photographing the site and taking soil samples, work that Webb watched with patient incomprehension. Before they left, As afternoon shadows lengthened, Foss walked the perimeter of the old homestead area. She found fragments of ceramics, a few corroded nails, the remains of a glass bottle. Nothing distinctive. But near the well, partially buried in leaf litter, she found something that made her pause. A small piece of carved stone, no larger than her palm, smooth on one side and worked with a pattern on the other. The pattern was geometric, precise. Webb identified it as possibly Cherokee in origin, which was not surprising given that the area had been Cherokee territory. Foss pocketed the stone and said nothing more about it at the time. Back in Athens, Foss intensified her research. She began searching for any documentation of Cherokee inhabitants on or near Vance's property before his purchase. The forced removal of Cherokee people from Georgia, culminating in the Trail of Tears of 1838, was well documented, but specific information about individual families or settlements in the Dahlonega district during the earlier period was fragmentary. She did find a reference in a letter written by a federal Indian agent in 1827, 2 years before the gold rush, describing a settlement of approximately 15 Cherokee families living along the Chestati River tributaries. The letter mentioned that these families were under increasing pressure from white settlers encroaching on treaty lands. By 1830, after the gold discovery, the pressure had become violence. The same area where Vance established his homestead had been occupied by Cherokee families less than 3 years before his arrival. What happened to those families? Some fled deeper into Cherokee territory to the north. Others were forcibly removed. A few individuals disappeared into the records of slavery, their indigenous identity obscured or erased as they were claimed as property by white settlers. This was not uncommon. The lines between slavery and removal, between African and indigenous heritage, were often deliberately blurred in frontier Georgia during this period. Foss began to wonder if Zenobia had been Cherokee or partially so. The name itself was not indigenous, but enslaved people often had their original names replaced with those chosen by their enslavers, names drawn from classical antiquity or the Bible. Zenobia, a 3rd-century queen of Palmyra who had challenged Roman authority and been defeated, enslaved, and paraded in triumph through Rome, before being granted a villa and pension for her remaining years. Was the name chosen with intentional irony? Did Zenobia herself have any say in it, or was it imposed? These questions had no clear answers. Foss requested access to Cherokee tribal records, but this proved difficult. The Cherokee Nation, understandably protective of their historical documents given centuries of exploitation and theft, did not grant access to outside researchers without substantial justification and tribal approval. Foss's inquiries were acknowledged, but not approved. She was left with fragmentary hints, suggestive patterns, but no definitive evidence. In November 1962, Foss received a letter from an unexpected source. The letter was from a woman named Sophronia Lattimore, a resident of Asheville, North Carolina, who identified herself as 91 years old and a descendant of enslaved people who had lived in the Dahlonega area during the gold rush period. Lattimore explained that she had heard about Foss's research through a cousin who worked at the Georgia Historical Society, and she had information that might be relevant. She invited Foss to visit her in Asheville at Foss's convenience. Foss made the trip in early December, driving the winding mountain roads to reach Lattimore's modest home on the outskirts of the city. Lattimore received her with formal courtesy, serving tea and sitting carefully in a chair by the window, where the light was good. Her memory, she acknowledged, was no longer perfectly reliable, but what she had to share was not personal memory. It was family memory, stories passed down from her grandmother, who had passed them down from her mother, and so on back to the time of slavery. According to Lattimore, her great-great-grandmother had been named Calpurnia, and Calpurnia had lived on a property near Dahlonega owned by a man whose name Lattimore could not remember with certainty, but thought might have been Vance. Calpurnia had been in her 20s at the time, already a woman of experience, and she had worked in the house rather than the fields or mines. The stories that came down through the family spoke of a woman in the house, not the owner's wife, there was no wife, but another woman who was present, who seemed to hold some position of importance that was never adequately explained. This woman was light-skinned, which Calpurnia had remembered, because it was notable in their community, and she was beautiful in a way that made men dangerous. The woman's name in the family stories was spoken with a kind of reverence and fear combined. She was called the Silent Woman, not because she did not speak, but because what she spoke was never to be repeated. Lattimore paused here, allowing Foss to absorb this. The Silent Woman had disappeared from the stories around 1835, the same year that Calpurnia and several others had been suddenly sold away to different owners in different parts of Georgia. Calpurnia herself was sold to a family in South Carolina, where she remained until emancipation. She never saw the others again. Foss asked if the family stories contained any specific details about what happened to the Silent Woman. Lattimore considered the question carefully. There was a story, she said, but it was one she had always been told to keep private, and she was sharing it now only because everyone directly connected to it was long dead, and perhaps it was time for the truth to be known, whatever the truth actually was. According to Calpurnia's account, as relayed through generations, there had been trouble at the house in the winter of 1835. Men had come, white men from town, and there had been shouting, accusations of some kind. Calpurnia had been ordered to stay in the kitchen house and not emerge no matter what she heard. She heard plenty, shouting, breaking, sounds that suggested violence. When she was finally allowed to return to the main house the next day, the Silent Woman was gone. So were two of the men who had lived on the property, enslaved men who had worked in the mines. The white men from town were gone as well. Calpurnia never received an explanation, and she knew better than to ask. Within a week she and several others were sold. The new owners were from the eastern part of the state, and uninterested in stories from Dahlonega. The Silent Woman was never mentioned again, at least not in Calpurnia's hearing. Lattimore added one more detail. Among the few possessions that Calpurnia had managed to keep through the various dislocations of her life was a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be gold dust. Not a large amount, perhaps a quarter ounce at most, but gold nonetheless. Calpurnia herself had inherited this pouch from someone on Vance's property, though the family memory was unclear about who exactly had given it to her. It had been passed down through the family as a kind of talisman. The story that came with it was that it had been earned, not stolen, not given as charity, but earned through work. The word earned was emphasized in the family telling because it was an unusual word to use in the context of slavery, where earning implied autonomy and compensation, neither of which were legally possible. Lattimore no longer had the pouch or its contents. It had been sold during the Depression years, when her own family needed money for food. But she remembered it clearly, remembered the way her grandmother would hold it and talk about the dignity of having something that was earned. Foss left Asheville with more questions than answers, but one conviction had solidified. Zenobia and the Silent Woman were the same person, and what had happened to her in 1835 was something that multiple parties had reason to conceal. The portrait had been painted over around the same time, if the stylistic analysis was correct. The enslaved people who might have witnessed events had been dispersed. The attorney Crenshaw had expressed discomfort, but ultimately complied with whatever legal fictions were required. And Cornelius Vance had lived another 12 years, gradually divesting his holdings and fading into the obscurity that local records suggested was his preferred state. What connected all of these elements? What was the band story that the portrait's concealment seemed designed to suppress. Foss's academic advisor, Professor Nathaniel Hartwell, grew concerned about the direction her research was taking. She had abandoned her original dissertation topic entirely and was pursuing what he considered a speculative investigation with insufficient evidence and too much reliance on oral history and circumstantial documentation. In a meeting in January 1963, he advised her to return to her original work or choose a new topic that could be adequately supported by traditional archival sources. Foss refused. She argued that the portrait itself was a primary source, that the X-ray evidence was scientific, that the pattern of documentary gaps and evasions pointed to something historically significant that had been deliberately obscured. Hartwell was unmoved. He informed her that if she continued in this direction, she would not receive departmental support for her research, and her prospects for completing her doctorate would be jeopardized. Foss chose to continue anyway. She withdrew from the doctoral program in February 1963 and took a job teaching high school history in Atlanta to support herself while continuing her private investigation. The next phase of Foss's research focused on the gold itself. If Zenobia or others on the property had possessed gold dust, as Lattimore's family story suggested, where had it come from? The obvious answer was Vance's mining operation, but the implications of that answer were troubling. Did Vance compensate enslaved workers with gold? Did they have access to gold through their labor in ways that subverted the total control slavery was supposed to impose? Or was there some other arrangement, some exchange, that fell outside the conventional understanding of slavery's absolute denial of economic agency? Foss obtained access to mining records from Lumpkin County, such as they existed. Record-keeping in the early gold rush was haphazard, but some claims were registered and some production figures were recorded for tax purposes. Vance's operation appeared to have been small-scale, using placer mining techniques to extract gold from stream beds and shallow deposits. His registered claims showed modest but consistent production from 1829 through 1834, then a sharp decline in 1835, and no further production after 1836. The decline coincided with Zenobia's disappearance and the dispersal of the enslaved workers who had presumably been doing the actual mining labor. One document Foss found particularly interesting was a complaint filed with the county magistrate in July 1834 by a neighboring claim holder named Josiah Merrick. Merrick accused Vance of operating his mining work in an irregular manner that violated community standards and possibly territorial law. The complaint was vague about specifics, referring only to practices unsuitable for Christian witness and arrangements that bring reproach upon honest labor. The magistrate's response, recorded in the margin of the complaint, was dismissive. He noted that Vance's claim was properly registered and that Merrick should tend to his own affairs. The complaint went no further, but its existence suggested that whatever Vance was doing on his property had attracted critical attention from at least one neighbor. Foss attempted to trace Merrick's descendants but found that he had left the area in 1835, selling his claim and moving to Alabama. His reasons for leaving were not recorded. By mid-1963, Foss had accumulated a substantial file of documentation, photographs, interviews, and analysis related to Zenobia and the portrait. She began drafting a manuscript, not an academic paper, but something more narrative in form, an attempt to reconstruct what she believed had happened. The core of her argument was this: Zenobia had not been merely an enslaved woman in the conventional sense. She had occupied some other position, some arrangement that granted her unusual status or privileges, and this arrangement was connected to the mining operation and possibly to Vance's acquisition of the property in the first place. The portrait, in its hidden form, commemorated this arrangement. The overpainted version represented the suppression of that arrangement after it became untenable or dangerous for reasons Foss could only speculate about. the dispersal of witnesses, the documentary silences, the nervous letter from Attorney Crenshaw, all pointed to a secret that involved not just individual immorality, but something that challenged the social order of frontier Georgia in ways that could not be openly acknowledged. What was that secret? Foss's manuscript, which exists in draft form in her archive papers, proposed several possibilities without committing fully to any single interpretation. One possibility was that Zenobia occupied a position analogous to what was sometimes called a housekeeper in frontier contexts, a euphemism for relationships that existed outside legal marriage but with some degree of acknowledged domestic partnership. Such relationships existed, certainly, but they were maintained through secrecy and euphemism, never commemorated in formal portraiture. If Vance had been arrogant or deluded enough to commission a portrait acknowledging such a relationship, he would have needed to conceal it quickly. Another possibility Foss explored was that Zenobia was not enslaved at all in her origins, but free, possibly of Cherokee heritage, and that Vance had falsely claimed her as property to prevent her being removed with other Cherokee during the clearances. This would explain the documentary void around her origins and the peculiar phrasing about earned gold. A third possibility, darker than the others, was that the arrangement on Vance's property involved some form of profit-sharing or compensation system with the enslaved workers, particularly those working the mines, and that this system had become known in the community and threatened the ideological foundations of slavery itself, which depended on the absolute denial of enslaved people's claim to the fruits of their labor. None of these possibilities satisfied Foss completely, but she recognized that complete certainty was impossible at this historical distance. What she had was a portrait, a collection of fragments, a pattern of silences, and a family memory of a woman who was beautiful, silent, and gone. In August 1963, she submitted her manuscript to several academic journals. All of them rejected it, citing insufficient evidence, speculative reasoning, or inappropriateness of topic for their publication standards. One editor wrote back personally to Foss, expressing sympathy for her work, but noting that topics involving intimate relationships across racial lines during slavery remained too controversial for mainstream academic publication, regardless of the quality of research. He suggested she might have better luck with the popular press, but warned that she would then be dismissed by serious scholars as a sensationalist. Foss was trapped between two forms of silence: academic respectability that demanded more evidence than history had preserved, and popular interest that would distort her findings into something unrecognizable. She returned to Dahlonega in October 1963, alone this time, to walk the property one final time before winter made the woods impassable. The leaves were turning, the air sharp with the smell of decay and renewal mixed. She stood by the old well, now completely overgrown, and tried to imagine what this place had been like in 1829, in 1835. Who had stood here? What had they seen? The well itself troubled her. Wells were often repositories of things people wanted hidden: objects, documents, bodies. She considered attempting to have the well explored, but the cost and the legal complications of accessing private land for archaeological excavation were beyond her resources. Instead, she took photographs and wrote in her journal entries that moved between careful observation and something more personal, almost confessional. She wrote about her own relationship to this research, how it had changed her, how the questions it raised about power and witness and silence had bled into her understanding of the present as much as the past. In November 1963, two events occurred that would effectively end Foss's investigation. The first was the assassination of President Kennedy, an event that, like all such watershed moments, seemed to alter the texture of time itself and make previous concerns feel trivial or misdirected. The second, more directly relevant, was a fire at Foss's apartment in Atlanta. The fire was determined to be accidental, caused by faulty wiring, but it destroyed most of her possessions, including her research files and, most devastatingly, the portrait of Zenobia. The painting had been stored in her apartment, as she had not found any institution willing to accept it into their collections. The canvas was reduced to ash and twisted frame fragments. The X-ray images and photographs survived, as they had been stored in a separate location, but the object itself was gone. Foss described her reaction to this loss in a letter to her sister dated December 1963. She wrote that she felt both grief and a strange relief, as if some burden had been lifted from her. She wondered if Zenobia herself would have wanted the portrait preserved, or if its destruction was somehow appropriate, a final erasure that completed what the overpainting had begun. After the fire, Foss largely abandoned her research. She continued teaching, eventually moving to a small college in South Carolina, where she spent the remainder of her career as an instructor of general history courses. She published nothing further on Zenobia or Cornelius Vance. When asked about the subject in later years, she would deflect or change topics. To one colleague who pressed her, she reportedly said that some stories resist telling, that the evidence always falls short, and that perhaps there are reasons for that, reasons built into the structure of history itself. She retired in 1985 and died in 1991. Her archived papers, donated to the Georgia Historical Society per the terms of her will, were not opened for research until 2003. And even then, access was restricted to credentialed scholars who could demonstrate serious academic purpose. Few applied. The story of Zenobia and the portrait had become, by then, a footnote, a curiosity in the margins of gold rush history. But the story does not end with Foss's death or the destruction of the portrait. In 2008, during a routine survey of historical cemeteries in Lumpkin County, a team of archaeologists from the University of Georgia discovered an unmarked burial site, approximately half a mile from the location Foss had identified as the Vance homestead. The site contained 3 graves arranged in a row, with no headstones or markers beyond slight depressions in the earth. Ground-penetrating radar suggested the presence of remains and possibly artifacts. A decision was made to carefully excavate one of the graves to determine if the site warranted more extensive study. The excavation took place over several days in the spring of 2009. What they found was the remains of an adult female, buried in a simple wooden coffin that had largely decomposed. The burial appeared to date from the 1830s, based on the few artifacts present. Fragments of indigo-dyed cloth, consistent with clothing worn by enslaved people of the period, a small iron ring of the type used in restraints, and, positioned near what would have been the right hand, a carved stone identical in size and pattern to the one Foss had found and photographed in 1962. The remains were sent for analysis. Forensic anthropology determined that the individual had been a woman of approximately 25 to 35 years of age at time of death, of mixed heritage, showing both African and indigenous skeletal characteristics. Cause of death could not be determined from the remains, which showed no obvious signs of trauma. Radiocarbon dating of the bone confirmed a death date in the mid-1830s, consistent with the Zenobia timeline. The carved stone was identified by a specialist in southeastern indigenous artifacts as Cherokee in origin, a type of personal talisman typically passed down through families. Whether these remains were actually Zenobia's cannot be stated with certainty. No DNA comparison was possible, as there were no known descendants to provide matching samples. The location of the grave near the Vance property, the time period, the mixed heritage, the presence of the stone, all pointed toward a connection. But connection is not proof. The University of Georgia archaeological team documented their findings, and then, at the request of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and several African American historical societies, arranged for the remains to be reburied in a ceremony that acknowledged both African and Cherokee heritage. The location of the reburial was not made public. The other two graves at the site were not excavated, and the area was left undisturbed. The question remains, what was the band story that the portrait of Zenobia supposedly exposed? After decades and multiple investigations, partial answers emerge, but nothing definitive. What seems likely, based on the accumulated evidence, is that Zenobia was a woman of both African and Cherokee heritage who lived on Cornelius Vance's property during the Georgia Gold Rush, that she occupied some position unusual enough to be commemorated in a formal portrait, that this position became dangerous or untenable around 1835, that she disappeared from the historical record at that point, and that she was buried near the property with a Cherokee talisman and no marker. What the position was, whether it involved intimate relationships, whether it involved economic arrangements that violated slavery's legal structures, whether it implicated Cherokee displacement and erasure, whether it was known and tacitly accepted by the local community until it became too visible to ignore, these questions branch into speculation. What is not speculation is that someone painted her portrait with care and skill, using paint mixed with gold dust, in a composition that showed her surrounded by others in a setting of some dignity. And then, for reasons we can reconstruct but not fully understand, someone, possibly the same artist, painted over that image, reduced it to a single figure stripped of context, and hid the painting away where it would not be seen for more than a century. The act of concealment preserved even as it suppressed. Without the overpainting, the original portrait might have been destroyed outright. By hiding it beneath a more acceptable image, the artist ensured that both versions survived, at least for a time. The X-ray images Foss obtained are now the only visual record of what the hidden portrait contained, since the physical object was destroyed in the 1963 fire. Those images are preserved in the Georgia Historical Society's archives, available to researchers who request access. They show a woman whose gaze meets the viewer directly, whose posture suggests neither submission nor defiance, but something more complex, a kind of witnessing. In 2015, a writer named Claudia Morrow published a historical novel loosely based on Foss's research and the Zenobia story. The novel took considerable liberties with the historical record, inventing dialogue and interior states for which no evidence existed, but it brought the story to a wider audience. Some critics praised it as an important recovery of a silenced narrative. Others criticized it for speculative excess and for potentially distorting the limited facts in service of narrative cohesion. Morrow herself acknowledged in interviews that she had made choices the historical evidence could not fully support, but argued that fiction could sometimes access truths that strict historical methodology could not reach. The novel's publication sparked renewed interest in the case. Amateur researchers and local historians in Georgia began investigating other unmarked burial sites near old mining claims, looking for similar patterns of mixed heritage graves and documentary voids. Some of this work was careful and respectful. Some of it was not. The Lumpkin County Historical Commission issued a statement in 2017 requesting that people not disturb potential burial sites without proper consultation with descendant communities and archaeological oversight. The portrait itself, or what remains of it in photographic and X-ray form, continues to circulate in academic contexts as an example of the complex ways that enslaved people's images were created, controlled, and contested in antebellum America. Art historians use it to discuss questions of representation and erasure. Historians of slavery use it to discuss the gaps and silences in the archive. Cherokee Nation historians have noted its possible relevance to the history of indigenous people enslaved or claimed as property during the removal period. But no consensus has emerged about what precisely the portrait documents or what the band story was. Some mysteries resist solution, not because the evidence is missing, though that is part of it, but because the questions themselves are constructed on assumptions that the past does not share. We ask, what was Zenobia's relationship to Cornelius Vance? The question assumes categories of relationship that may not have existed in those terms, in that place, at that time. We ask, why was the portrait hidden? The question assumes a single, coherent motivation that documentary silence makes impossible to recover. What we have instead of answers is a pattern of absences and fragments that point toward something that once existed and was then deliberately obscured. We have a woman's face, rendered twice, once in acknowledgement and once in denial. We have gold dust mixed into paint. We have a grave marked only by a stone, whose meaning we can guess at but not confirm. We have the testimony of a family that remembered across generations, a woman who was silent not because she could not speak, but because what she knew was dangerous to say. We have an attorney's nervous letter about signing papers that troubled his conscience. We have a neighbor's complaint about practices unsuitable for Christian witness. We have a sudden dispersal of people who might have testified to what they saw. We have a fire that destroyed the physical object just as research was beginning to coalesce. We have a student who gave up her academic career to pursue a story that would not resolve. All of these are facts, documented in various ways, but they do not add up to a narrative that can be told with the kind of certainty that history is supposed to provide. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the band story is not a specific, scandalous detail about relationships or economic arrangements or criminal acts, though those may have been present. Perhaps the band story is the fact of Zenobia herself, her presence as a subject rather than object, her gaze meeting the viewer, her existence in a space of ambiguity that the social structures of 1830s Georgia could not accommodate and so had to erase. The portrait in its hidden form documented that existence. The portrait in its overpainted form performed the erasure. Both versions are true. Both versions are lies. The woman who was painted existed. The woman who was painted over existed. They are the same woman seen from different necessities. In 2019, a descendant of Sophronia Lattimore contacted the Georgia Historical Society to add information to the Zenobia file. The descendant, whose name was not made public at her request, reported that her great-aunt, before her death, had shared one additional piece of family memory that Sophronia herself had not felt comfortable sharing with Foss in 1962. According to this memory, passed down from Calpurnia, the silent woman had not disappeared involuntarily in 1835. She had left. She had walked away one night, taking nothing, telling no one, and she had not been pursued. The white men who came to the house were not looking for her, but for something she had taken with her, something they believed she had no right to possess. They did not find it because she had already gone. Whether this version of events is accurate cannot be verified. It contradicts some elements of the other evidence while being compatible with others. But it offers a different ending to the story, one in which Zenobia exercised agency in her own disappearance, one in which her silence was not just something imposed upon her, but something she chose. If true, it would mean that the grave near the Vance property is not necessarily hers, or that she returned at some later point to be buried there, or that the grave belongs to someone else entirely whose story has been conflated with Zenobia's over the generations of telling. We cannot know. The evidence, such as it is exhausted. No new documents have emerged, and none are likely to. The last people who might have had direct knowledge of any part of these events died more than a century ago. What remains is the pattern, the suggestion, the haunting sense of a story that was deliberately destroyed, but that has left traces, like the gold dust in the paint, like the carved stone in the grave, like the X-ray image of a hidden portrait. These traces tell us that something happened, that someone existed, that her existence mattered enough to be commemorated and then concealed. They tell us that the concealment itself was an act of preservation, however paradoxical that sounds. They tell us that we are asking questions that may not have answers, but that the asking itself is a form of witness. Miriam Foss wrote in one of her final journal entries about the project, dated November 1963, shortly before the fire. I have come to understand that Zenobia is not a mystery to be solved, but a presence to be acknowledged. The portrait, both versions of it, is not evidence, but testimony. It testifies to her having been seen, really seen, at least once. And then it testifies to that seeing being denied. Both testimonies are necessary. I cannot reconcile them, but I can hold them together. Perhaps that is enough. The fire came 3 weeks later. Whether Foss would have continued her research if the portrait had survived is unknowable. What is known is that she stopped. She turned to other work, other questions. She lived another 28 years without publishing a word about Zenobia. Was that surrender, or wisdom, or simple exhaustion? The gold rush in Dahlonega lasted only a few years before the larger strikes in California drew away the miners. By the 1840s, the region had settled into a quieter mode, agriculture and small-scale timber, the mines largely abandoned or worked sporadically by locals. The Cherokee were gone, forcibly removed to the west. The enslaved people who had worked the mines were dispersed to other owners, other labor. Cornelius Vance lived out his life in the house that visitors like Reverend Pratt found unwelcoming. He died in 1847, apparently of natural causes, and was buried in a cemetery that no longer exists. Its location now underneath a commercial development built in the 1950s. His grave, if it was ever marked, is unmarked now. The inventory of his estate showed modest assets and no heirs. The property was sold to satisfy debts and passed through hands until it was subdivided and largely forgotten. The well was filled in at some point, the house collapsed or was torn down, the forest reclaimed what it could. By the time Foss arrived in 1962, there was almost nothing left to see. But she saw it anyway. She saw the absence, and she understood that absence had shape. The story of Zenobia, such as we have it, is ultimately a story about seeing and not seeing, about what gets preserved in the historical record and what gets excluded, about the deliberate acts of erasure that people undertake when the truth becomes too costly to acknowledge. The portrait is the perfect emblem of this dynamic. It preserves even as it conceals. It testifies even as it denies. The woman in the painting looks out at us across nearly 2 centuries, and her gaze is direct, unflinching, aware of being watched. She knows she is being painted. She knows she is being seen. And then someone paints over her, reduces her to a simpler image, hides her away. But the hiding does not destroy. It only delays. Eventually, X-ray technology reveals what lies beneath. Eventually, researchers ask questions. Eventually, the fragments accumulate to the point where they demand attention. But they never accumulate to the point of certainty. We can see that she was there. We cannot see what happened to her with the clarity that would allow us to narrate her life as we narrate the lives of people whose existence was deemed worthy of full documentation. This disparity is not accidental. It is structural. The archive preserves what power wants preserved. It discards or obscures what power finds inconvenient or dangerous. Zenobia was inconvenient. Her existence, in whatever form it took, challenged categories that the society of 1830s Georgia needed to maintain. And so she was made to disappear, not through physical violence, or not only through that, but through documentary violence, the systematic denial of evidence that she had ever existed as anything more than a line in a tax ledger. The portrait was an anomaly, a crack in that system. It documented her as a subject, as someone whose image deserved preservation in the medium reserved for people of status. The overpainting was the correction, the system reasserting itself. But the correction was incomplete. The underlying image survived. And so we have this paradox, a document of erasure that is also a document of presence. Foss understood this, or came to understand it, over the course of her research. Her manuscript, fragmentary as it is, shows a gradual shift from trying to solve a mystery to trying to understand the conditions that made the mystery necessary. She stopped asking what happened to Zenobia and started asking why we don't know what happened to Zenobia. That second question is more productive because it has an answer. We don't know because people with power decided we shouldn't know. They burned papers, they dispersed witnesses, they painted over portraits, they buried bodies without markers. These were deliberate choices, not accidents of time or neglect, and the pattern of those choices tells us something even when the specific details remain obscure. It tells us that Zenobia mattered enough to be erased carefully. That is a form of acknowledgement, however perverse. The final image we have of Zenobia is the X-ray, a ghostly double exposure showing both versions of the portrait superimposed. In this image, she appears both dressed in simple indigo and in richer garments, both alone and accompanied, both visible and concealed. The image is technically accurate, but aesthetically strange, almost modernist in its fragmentation. It shows us the truth of the portrait, which is that there is no single truth, only layers of representation and concealment that cannot be fully separated. We cannot see the original portrait without seeing the overpainting. We cannot see the overpainting without knowing what it hides. The two images are bound together in a way that resists resolution. This is fitting. The story of Zenobia resists resolution. We can accumulate evidence. We can analyze patterns. We can listen to family memories passed down across generations. But we cannot achieve the kind of closure that a complete narrative would provide. What we can do is acknowledge the gaps, the silences, the places where the archive fails. We can recognize that failure as meaningful, as itself a historical fact that requires explanation. The banned story, then, is not a single scandalous revelation waiting to be uncovered. It is the entire structure of concealment, the network of choices and silences and erasures that made it possible for a woman to exist, to be painted, and then to vanish from the historical record with only fragments remaining. The story is banned not because one person or institution prohibits its telling, but because the archive itself, the entire system of documentation and preservation that we rely on to know the past, was constructed to make such stories untellable. They can be gestured toward, indicated through absences, but they cannot be narrated with the confidence and completeness that we expect from historical accounts. This is frustrating for researchers who want answers. It is devastating for descendants who want to know their ancestors. But it is also instructive. It teaches us to read the archive differently, to pay attention not just to what is present, but to what is missing, to understand that absences have patterns and that patterns have meaning. Zenobia, whoever she was, whatever her relationship to Cornelius Vance, whatever her relationship to the gold and the land and the other people who lived and worked on that property, existed. She was real. Someone painted her portrait with enough skill and care to suggest that she was valued, at least by someone. Someone else, possibly the same person, decided that the portrait was too dangerous to remain visible and painted over it. But they did not destroy it. They hid it. And in hiding it, they preserved it, at least for a time. The portrait survived until 1963, when fire destroyed it. But the X-ray images survived the fire, and the story, such as it is, survived Miriam Foss's death. And the fragments, the letters, the family memories, the grave with the carved stone, all of these survived to be assembled into this account, which is not a solution but an acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is not nothing. To say that Zenobia existed, that her image was created and concealed, that people who knew her kept silence about what they knew, that descendants remember her across generations even when the details are lost. To say these things is to resist the erasure even when we cannot reverse it. The banned story remains banned in the sense that we cannot tell it completely. But it is no longer hidden in the sense that we know it exists. We know something happened. We know someone was there. We know her face, at least as filtered through an artist's interpretation and an X-ray machine's rendering. We know she was called the Silent Woman, and we know that silence was both imposed and possibly chosen. We know she had connection to gold dust, and we know she was buried with a stone that connected her to Cherokee heritage. We know that people were uncomfortable enough with something about her presence or her status to disperse witnesses and conceal evidence. These are facts, however, fragmentary. They point toward a life that was lived, choices that were made, a presence that mattered. The portrait of Zenobia, in both its visible and hidden forms, is now part of the historical record, not as a physical object, but as a documented phenomenon. Art historians cite it. Researchers of slavery reference it. Descendants of enslaved people in Georgia sometimes mention it when discussing the gaps in their family histories. It has become a symbol of a certain kind of historical absence, the kind that has shape and weight even when it lacks substance. And perhaps that is the most we can ask for from stories like this. Not resolution, but recognition. Not answers, but acknowledgement. The banned story will remain banned in its specifics. But the fact of the ban, the fact that banning was necessary, is itself a story worth telling. It tells us that power is always threatened by witnesses, that visibility is always political, that some people are erased so thoroughly that only traces remain, but that traces, properly attended to, are enough to prove that someone was there. In the forests northeast of Dahlonega, there is a place where a house once stood. The exact location is not marked on any map. The well is filled or collapsed, the foundation stones scattered or buried. The trees grown thick over ground that once was cleared. Visitors who know where to look can find the old white oak with the iron ring grown into its trunk, though even that will eventually disappear as the tree ages and falls. There are 3 graves nearby, 2 of them unexcavated, their occupants unknown. One of them may be Zenobia, or she may have walked away, as the family story suggests, and may be buried somewhere else entirely, or not buried at all, her bones scattered or lost. We do not know, we will not know, but we know she was there, in that place, at that time. We know someone saw her clearly enough to paint her portrait. We know someone else was frightened enough by that portrait to hide it. And we know that hiding, paradoxically, was what allowed the image to survive long enough for us to see it, even in its fragmentary, mediated form. That is enough. It has to be enough. The story is banned, but the ban is documented. The woman is erased, but the erasure is visible. And in that visibility, however partial, however frustrating, lies something that resembles truth, or at least testimony. The story of Zenobia is not solved, but it is told as much as it can be, which is to say, partially, provisionally, with all the gaps and silences acknowledged rather than filled. This is the shape of historical truth when the archive has been weaponized against certain lives. This is what remains when concealment fails to be complete. A portrait painted twice. A woman who was there.